Hi everyone, welcome. So I think my name is Hannah Proctor. I wrote a book called Burnout, The Emotional Experience of Political Defeat, which overlaps in some thematic ways, if not in the kind of specific context, with some of the themes in Matt's book. But to start, maybe you can open with a little reading from the book and maybe a very quick kind of, this is my book.
Yes, so this is my book. Thank you everyone for coming on this beautiful sunny evening, and yeah, thanks to Burning House for letting us do this here, and I'm really glad that Hannah can be here for reasons which I will address momentarily. But yeah, I'll just explain for sort of 5 minutes the background of this book. I guess most people here are probably aware of the overall context, but I'll quickly sketch that for folks here so they're up to speed in terms of what I'm talking about, and I'll then read a little 5-minute extract which gives a flavour of some of the themes of the book, and especially those which relate to the stuff that Hannah also works on. And then, yeah, I think we'll have a bit of a discussion. There'll be time for, questions or exchange between us and people on the floor. There is at least one other person in the room who has written a very good book about Rojava, who will also be available to answer any questions to which I am incompetent. But yeah, so this book is called Hope Without Hope, Rojava and Revolutionary Commitment. And I began writing this book while I was in this place, Rojava. So to give some context as to what that is, the Kurds are a people without a state of their own, numbering some 40 million in the Middle East. For a long time they fought for a state of their own. Some of them still do, but in the course of that struggle, their sort of leading political movement resigned that idea, decided that any state, even if they could build a Kurdish state, would be inherently repressive against other minorities living within its borders, and instead they wanted to do something different and build a society which is based on community self-determination, building from the grassroots up rather than the top down, with a particular role for women and sort of autonomous women's organisations throughout that society. And also a cooperative economy and sort of special place for the other minorities living in that region within that system. This utopian political vision rather unexpectedly became a reality in the course of the Syrian civil war, where this movement was able to take control of a large swathe of territory and begin implementing these ideas on a mass scale in a region which is known by the Kurdish name Rojava, and which today probably numbers some 3 to 4 million people, and where they've begun trying to implement these ideas on the ground. As you can imagine, this process has been very fraught and very difficult, a lot of struggles, a lot of setbacks, a lot of crises, a lot of challenges, and those kind of organisational lessons are part of what I speak about in this book, kind of Hope Without Hope. How did it come to be that this utopian vision developed in the middle of the chaos, the ethnic cleansing, the bloodshed, the catastrophe of the Syrian civil war, and how have they continued hoping in the face of that hopelessness in terms of their practice? But there's also, I think, a more profound level to why I wanted to write this book, and yeah, that's what I hope that we'll probably speak about more today. Obviously, it's linked to these political questions. But yeah, a lot of international volunteers went out in the course of that conflict that these Kurdish forces fought, particularly against ISIS and against the Turkish armed forces, to establish this vision, and joined in different ways. Some people went out and fought there in the military to defend these ideals of women's autonomy, of sort of direct democracy and community self-determination against these two states that were trying to destroy it. Other people like myself went out to volunteer in different capacities. I'm a journalist by background, and I went out to work in the media field there. And part of the reason I went was for these organisational things. I wanted to see what would it look like to have these ideas implemented on the ground, to understand, can it be true? How do they actually manage to do all this and, keep millions of people safe, feed them and so on? But I was also drawn, I suppose, to the idea of there being something worth hoping in. I think I felt personally quite hopeless before I went out to Rojava due to, the difficulty of organising that we all face. And so, as well as understanding the political programme, relatedly, I wanted to feel hope, I guess, and to understand, how this hope came from hopelessness on a very personal level. And as I say in the book, a lot of the lessons that I learned there, and I think the lessons that are on offer, are not necessarily organisational, although, those are important, but they're also sort of psychological. How do we think? How do we feel? How do we relate to one another? And the way the Kurdish movement approaches all of these things, I think, kind of time and again, it reminded me of this idea of hope coming out of hopelessness, an idealistic vision coming out of despair, but having to go through that despair and that hopelessness first. So that's sort of, the general idea of the book. And so I'm going to read, just like for 5 minutes now, the beginning of one of the chapters, where I suppose I speak about, some of these ideas and what they mean, and then how I saw them working in Syria. Absurdist philosophers have long recognized the paradoxically freeing effects of despair and cynicism. They perceive the fundamental meaninglessness of the universe, what they would term the amoral, chaotic void into which humans have been thrust. But these absurdist philosophers, like Camus and Kierkegaard, attempt to venture beyond this meaningless, exploring the paradox through which we humans continue seeking truth and meaning, even when we fear, believe, or know that there is no meaning to be found. A consciously politicized form of absurdist thought potentially has much to offer our contemporary left movements. It can help us to make sense of our own ridiculous striving for a better world in the face of the apparent reality that no such better world is readily available. On the personal, organizational, and even national levels, the Kurdish movement's theory and practice offer useful models of absurdist thought animating day-to-day political commitment. Both the international volunteers in Rojava and Kurdish comrades themselves draw on a diverse range of potentially absurd tactics: self-delusion, self-effacement, deliberate forgetfulness, posing, virtue signalling, even the aesthetic fetishization of revolution. Indeed, many of these tactics are already in place in different ways throughout our contemporary society and in movements on the Western left, suggesting ways we might reckon with and travel beyond our despair. Worldwide, younger generations are demonstrating a greater and greater commitment to political organisation, even in the absence of an organised and credible left movement capable of mounting a challenge to capitalism, imperialism, or genocide. This quality is mocked by the right as copium, or hopium, a self-delusion, since we're unable to admit the scale of the challenges we face, high on this seemingly self-deluding hope endemic among the left. Opium is a narcotic, but as Karl Marx suggests with regard to religion, it's also an anaesthetic. It can help us to endure a surgical intervention and return to life, perhaps dizzy and weakened, but healed and ready for renewed struggle. In Rojava, as elsewhere worldwide, this absurd political commitment is not the preserve of an elite, activist, or vanguard class, and neither it is a philosophical nicety divorced from everyday life. Rather, absurdist thought patterns are a daily reality throughout society. Ordinary people frequently display a startlingly radical political commitment, even to the extent that this might resemble self-delusion to sceptical Western eyes. A bloody-minded refusal to surrender is often most acute, precisely where the Rojava revolution has suffered the worst setbacks, forcing people to choose a radical commitment to its principles anew. In 2018, the Syrian Kurdish region of Afrin was occupied by Turkey, which forcibly displaced most of the Kurdish locals living there. Yet many of the 200,000 displaced Kurds chose to remain in an isolated exclave adjoining their occupied homeland, living in barren refugee camps, rather than withdrawing to slightly safer cities elsewhere. When I asked one elderly camp resident if she wasn't worried by living in range of the artillery shells that Turkish-backed militias regularly lobbed toward her refugee camp, she looked at me askance. "My tent isn't close to the front line," she said. "It's close to Afrin, my home." She wanted to at least smell the wind coming from our homeland's lost olive groves, she said, in a phrase often repeated by other refugees, to the point of cliché. And in turn, her defiant presence, pointless in the sense that there was and remains no realistic hope of her returning home, was nonetheless able to create a real political impact, enabling the Kurdish political movement to retain their strategic military foothold and an ideological horizon to struggle towards. Their occupied homeland, many of these displaced Kurds repeated to me wistfully, was heaven, an Eden of olive groves sprouting from Syria's most fertile soil. As the metaphor suggests, Afrin remains ideal, unobtainable, and for this reason capable of motivating great personal sacrifice. This tension is inherent in the very materiality of Afrin's refugee camps, where canvas is slowly being surrounded by concrete supporting walls, potted plants, and ragged vegetable patches. Each home embodies the conflicted yet symbiotic relationship between hard years in the wilderness and the enduring hope of return. For as long as these camps remain, a potent and unfulfilled hope will continue to spring up, its unreachable source just over the front line. This doesn't imply any superhuman proclivity for resistance on behalf of the Kurds alone, idealising this diverse people or treating them as a monolithic bloc. Much the same mentality was present among civilian Arab families I met in the aftermath of the war against ISIS, who returned to bombed-out homes to hang up washing on lines strung between ruined walls, still dirty with ash and blood, willing community out of almost nothing. As in the Palestinian refugee camps throughout the West Bank and beyond, and in similar sites of tenacious resistance worldwide, these displaced Syrians prefer to remain in limbo. The Palestinians clutch rusted keys handed down through generations as a mute symbol of their implausible belief that they will one day open their own front doors again, front doors they may never even have seen. Neither vanquished nor with hope of victory, they remain, like the rebel in Camus' absurdist philosophy, suspended in the active and productive tension of continued struggle. Resistance is life, a famous Kurdish slogan runs, but for many ordinary Kurds, it's more accurate to say that life is resistance. Thanks.
So I actually did have a few questions that are quite specific to this context. Maybe even some about strategy and stuff before we get into the more like hope, despair, like bigger.
Yeah.
Is that fine?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's how the book goes as well.
Yeah.
So.
I just wondered if you could maybe say a little bit about what's going on right now with the PKK, and there's this question of it's not about the book, because obviously that's happened since you wrote the book, presumably.
Yes, yeah,
and I just wondered if you could just briefly kind of explain.
So sort of there's been a lot going on in the Middle East, as you're sure you're aware, and like almost all of it is terrible. And this region, Rojava, has been caught up in those changes that have happened since the genocide began in Gaza, which has had different effects and has sort of further threatened, in some ways, this project, but has also changed the dynamic in ways that are still playing out. So the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is led by Abdullah Öcalan, is the movement that I was talking about, which came up with this vision and fought for this vision, for a long time. For 40 years, they've been in this guerrilla war with Turkey, and that's been continuing all this time. As I said, in the course of the Syrian civil war, the PKK's Syrian affiliates were able to take these ideas, which until then had been something that could kind of only occur in certain refugee camps, could occur kind of clandestinely in Turkish society, and start doing them on the kind of mass scale. And that was happening in Syria, and in the course of that, those PKK affiliates forged a relationship with the United States and therefore also with the British government, among others, in the course of their war against ISIS. So all that was going on, and that, of course, has brought its own compromises, like as you can imagine, and its own dangers to the revolution. But nonetheless, in Syria, they were able to sort of carve out a space, between the American-Russian intervention and sort of continue trying to implement these ideas amid the sort of new Cold War that was playing out in Syria. Meanwhile, the PKK continued their fight against Turkey, who are a key NATO force, sort of key US ally in the region, up until this year. And at the beginning of this year, Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of this movement, who's been in jail for the past 25 years, solitary isolation on an island off the Turkish coast, announced that sort of he felt the time had come for the PKK to end this armed struggle and to move to a sort of civil society organization, engage kind of, I guess, more fully with legal politics in Turkey, and to sort of stop the armed struggle. I mean, and then the sort of geostrategic reasons for that are complicated. They're to do with Turkey wanting to realign itself, to demonstrate that it's a good partner to the West, Turkey's fears of Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other. But maybe the geopolitical questions are less significant here than the sort of political message and what does this mean. And so, as I said, the sort of the Kurdish movement has long it doesn't want an armed force fighting in perpetuity. What it wants is this civil society network that will kind of replace the state. So they do have in place a lot of the things that they're talking about already in Rojava, but also in other parts of Kurdistan. They have been able to build up this huge kind of network, and I think that includes armed forces, but also this legal parliamentary party, but also civil society organisations, community reconciliation organisations, women's organisations, and so on and so forth. And they have a great, I suppose, kind of strength and depth. And I think that's one thing that helps them to stop from despairing. That helps them to hope. Right, is that there's a sort of knowledge that okay, we may have been fighting and we may have been suffering and dying, but that we know that this is creating benefits for women in civil society somewhere else in Kurdistan. Or on the other hand, there might be some people who are forced to put on a suit and tie and go and do parliamentary politics and shake hands with their oppressors, but they know there are people who are living in freedom in these guerrilla camps. So there's something about that diversity of tactics and knowing that, your comrades are doing different things, which I think, is important, not just organisationally, but in terms of helping people to understand this process. So this at the moment, this kind of disarmament deal is going ahead. I was there in the mountains of Kurdistan where there was this ceremony whereby these Kurdish fighters, who have been up in the mountains fighting this guerrilla war for 40 years, came down and ceremonially built a pyre of their weapons and burned them as a sort of gesture of peace, I suppose, to the Turkish authorities. And it was a very hard moment, I think, for the Kurdish people there. If you imagine you've spent your life in this war, so many people have died. There are women there whose children had died fighting in this war, and you're forced to sort of, walk away, as it were, naked without your weapon. I think that was very hard. They also made a point at the same time of building their weapons into what resembled the Kurdish New Year fire, the Nuruz fire, which for them is a symbol of renewal and of this transition to civil society organisation. So I think it's not completely clear yet what it's going to mean. It can potentially have benefits in terms of what's happening in Rojava. It can potentially have benefits in terms of the situation for the Kurdish people in Turkey, but also Turkey is very much pursuing its own agenda and seeking to reassert its dominance in the region. So we have to see what will come of it. But until now, in terms of Rojava, it's still there and it hasn't been affected directly by this decision.
Okay, yeah. You mentioned then the significance of Abdullah Öcalan, and the book is quite theoretically rich and draws on quite a lot of different thinkers, but one thing that you do is actually talk quite a lot about his work and his centrality as a thinker and a theorist, right, in some sense. So I wonder if you could maybe briefly introduce some of his sort of kind of, because it feels like it's there sort of in.
It's his kind of intellectual journey is extremely interesting, again, as I said, he began life, as the leader of the PKK, which at that time was a sort of straightforward Marxist-Leninist guerrilla fighting for an independent socialist Kurdish state, and, as other national liberation movements did during the 20th century. But the PKK took this different course, which I've spoken about, and there are several reasons for that, one of which is Öcalan's own kind of intellectual journey that he went on. A sort of crucial part of that was that, sort of women have always had, to some degree, a prominent role in Kurdish society, and within the PKK there formed early on this very strong sort of autonomous women's movement, which sort of exerted a lot of pressure on the PKK to establish a sort of autonomous women's army, as they called it, and also to challenge some of the internal, initially I suppose, patriarchal practices of the PKK as at that time, a very strict party led by this male figurehead, Öcalan, and he was, to his credit, responsive to that, and he listened to that, and that was one key influence. And then I think, we come also to this question of, kind of getting hope from hopelessness, learning from defeat. And I think his vision, sort of politically also came out of a recognition which developed in the course of the 1990s, after the collapse of state socialism, the realization that actually there wasn't going to be an independent Kurdish state. This was never going to happen for them. And, the imperial powers had already divided up the Middle East, and he kind of was able to go beyond that and say, well, actually, even if there were a independent Kurdish state, that in turn would become repressive. And I think then reflecting on that, he looked back into Middle Eastern history and said, well, actually, then the sort of the statelessness of the Kurds and their long-term experience of being outside the state then becomes, not a weakness, but a strength. And that's something we should celebrate and build on to build this new society that they want to create. And he then kind of goes even further than that and says, well, actually, this region, Kurdistan, is Mesopotamia. So it's kind of the cradle of civilization. It's where, in some sense, the state developed. And he sort of reaches right back into history to a sort of what he would view as a matriarchal civilization, or a not necessarily matriarchal, but a more equal civilization that existed way back when, prior to the rise of the city-state and then the nation-state, and says, well, actually, this region is where the state began, so this is kind of where it has to be undone. And yeah, and in doing that, he draws also on other thinkers, some of whom I mentioned in the book. Like Silvio Federici, he draws on Michel Foucault, among others. And so he developed these ideas and was able to communicate them also to the outside world. So as I mentioned, he was captured by Turkey, and a lot of this thought occurred while he was being held in isolation there on this prison island. And he was able to get it out to the world, the rest of the world, as his defense writings. He submitted them in lieu of his defense at court. A little like Antonio Gramsci, he was kind of able to smuggle these ideas to the outside world. And again, I think you see the impact of that personal experience of his on these ideas. And so now they're in, maybe sort of the final word is obviously it creates now this weird situation where this movement espouses a sort of bottom-up grassroots approach, but as I speak about in the book, it still makes use of a lot of tactics that we would be used to thinking of as associated with the Leninist party. He's very much still the leader of this party, right? He's the figurehead, and he kind of, in a weird way, he embodies, to the Kurdish women's movement, a lot of these ideas of women's autonomy come through him, this old guy with a moustache. So it's kind of odd, and then that's further complicated by the fact that he's been in isolation for most of the past 3 decades. So he's not, it's not like he's sitting in a sort of palace somewhere in Kurdistan, directing everything that's going on, but is more, I think, a sort of ideological leader and a symbol, and has communicated these ideas, but he's not involved in the day-to-day implementation of these ideas. So somehow I think, that has made sense, for the Kurdish movement. It's quite a particular set of circumstances that have led to that. And now, in the course of this kind of thaw between the Kurdish movement and Turkey, which is kind of going on now, he's been allowed to communicate, sort of for the first time in a very long time, which was something huge for the Kurdish people, because, he's like their Nelson Mandela, right? And they hadn't heard from him for years and years, so he's been able to send these messages out. But I suppose the question now is, what will happen? Is it possible he will be released? What will that mean for the movement and these ideas? But that's all in the future.
I want to just come back to what you were just saying about this kind of some of this kind of quite contradictory aspect of, on the one hand, this is a quite orthodox Marxist-Leninist, or some of the things going on there, but on the other, you have these much more horizontalist things going on. And you talk a bit in the book about Vincent Bevan's book, If We Burn, which is about the protest movements of the 2010s and kind of why they so often were ended in defeat, or often even in kind of more authoritarian systems coming in the aftermath of sort of uprisings and revolutions, but doesn't talk about Rojava. But his book was in turn very influenced by Rodrigo Nunes's work, neither vertical nor horizontal, which you talk about in the book, and the thesis of that book is kind of in the title. And you talk about, what do you say, a kind of networked Leninism versus vanguard anarchism. So it's these but it seems also the question of the kind of simultaneously vertical and horizontal seems to also be at play in what you're talking about.
I think this book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, is really good. And I think what's kind of interesting about it is, I guess it's not only saying, we need a sort of combination of, sort of something which learns from both, sort of the failures of top-down sort of vertical, classicist Marxist-Leninist organisation, and from the failures of, sort of decentralized protest movements which have generally failed to achieve change during the past 15 years. I think most people would agree with that, that we need to learn from both. But what he also says is actually all movements always have something of both in them. So he's sort of trying to get away, I guess, from the sort of the idea that these two are necessarily opposed. And actually, any movement, no matter how decentralized, will always have some form of internal hierarchy and things to identify that and understand it and see what can be done with it, and that that's something that the Kurdish movement would practice in their internal organisation. But then also the question is, what does that kind of mean politically? In these books, I think, they're very good. There's another book by a guy, Asef Bayat, who says something similar about the Arab Spring and why did all those protest movements, obviously they're related, kind of fail because there was a sort of faith in this pure kind of grassroots, spontaneous, bottom-up thing, which for me, it's also a kind of question of yeah, it's a question of hope, right? Because people want to kind of do something, and there's this great sort of drive, and in this era, especially those guys were talking about that, you also speak about in your book in sort of 2011, 2012, there was this great outpouring of desire for change, but then nothing happened, right? Or not nothing happened, but it failed. It failed to achieve its goals. And so I think, Rojava is useful not because they've done everything right, and all those other movements did everything wrong, but I think it's important as it can maybe help us to think about, okay, to what extent, where do our own movements land on that scale? And I suppose organisationally, for me, it's the Kurdish movement has moved from this very strict top-down organisation towards a degree of, kind of greater, horizontalism, listening to the grassroots and so on, having, sort of making sure that, particularly women, but also all, groups are represented in internal political processes, but while still retaining aspects of that organisation, retaining a sort of culture of discipline, for example, retaining a certain kind of, aesthetic and moral standards they expect its followers to subscribe to, for example, things which to us were a bit like, oh, but to them that's kind of not it's not necessarily a contradiction, and in fact those things can be sort of more freeing to people. They would, that they would argue. And so I think, they're kind of moving from the vertical down to the horizontal, whereas our movements tend to be horizontal, but thinking, okay, maybe actually we do need a bit of that. So we can kind of approach one another, and I think there's things to be learned, like in both ways. And I think, with the sort of Rojava case study, it's sometimes treated as, if people know about it, it's this sort of interesting thing, but it's kind of over there and it doesn't, it's just a sort of experiment, right? But, it's, to me, it's very big and it's very embedded in a lot of these dynamics, and it came out of the Arab Spring. It occurred, at the same time and in line with the principles of those movements. It has also certainly its own unique characteristics, but I think those are also what enabled this vision to kind of survive and to still exist on the ground today. And so I think being able to think about what happened there in conversation, with that broader wave of global protests, particularly with the Arab Spring, can kind of sort of open the way to thinking through some of those lessons from the perspective of other protest movements.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is just a sort of interest that I have, or something that I've read quite a bit about, is self-criticism practices. And I'm always really interested in, because I guess that's another example in this context, which is in some ways like an inheritance from a sort of orthodox party practice, right, in some ways, but obviously it's taken on its own form in that context as well. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what is self-criticism in that context, and the tech mill or whatever, kind of, and how it kind of is embedded, because I think actually these are kind of traditions on the left that I think on the Western left were really associated with kind of Maoism, and often took quite sort of scary forms, or forms that were not necessarily particularly productive, and so perhaps got kind of caricatured as being sort of quite puritanical. But I wonder, maybe you could just say a little bit about.
I'm gonna flip this question back to you in a minute, so be prepared. But so the Kurdish movement practices criticism and self-criticism, right? So it's an example, I suppose, of one of these more internal things that they've retained, as you say. Sort of there's something they've been doing since the time they were this top-down Leninist party, and they still do it today, but they tried to do it in a different way, in a more productive way. And maybe I'll speak first about what that looks like, and then I'll say a couple of the sort of why that might be interesting to us, as we think about how we relate to people around us. I guess the idea of it, the sort of criticism, self-criticism, right, is the sort of Kurdish movement's idea that revolution begins, begins subjectively. It begins in the individual person, but those people are in a material context, right? So again, it's a little bit getting away from, again, as you try to in your book, the sort of opposition between, there are macro political responses and we just need to make society better, then everyone will be better, but also to, I guess, get away from a sort of individualism and the idea that you should just kind of fix yourself and not worry about anything else, right? So it's a very sort of communal, collective process, and I guess it's about understanding where people come from and how they relate to other people. In a criticism session, you'll be with most likely with a group of people, maybe about this size, maybe a little smaller, maybe even a little bigger. you'll be working together, well, whether that's in the military or in like a women's organization, or maybe you're in a, like political course together. And you would, like sort of take time to like reflect on, what are your sort of shared standards, right? And, what are your aims and what are your goals and what are you striving for? And you would then think as kind of firstly about yourself, like to what extent have you lived up to those, in the past week or whatever it is. And also, what about other people? Are there ways that other people have not like lived up to the standards you feel that they could do better? Maybe do better is the wrong word, but you could sort of help them to recognize why they're struggling in that. And so I think, first point to emphasize is what's really important is for there to be a shared goal and a shared idea. And again, sort of if you all agree more or less on how you should be living, what's the goal that you want, then you can say, well, we all agree, of course, that whatever it might be, that we should treat one another with respect, and you're not doing that. But and that I think is really important, because if you have different ideas of how to organize your lives, it then becomes difficult. And if you're not all don't all have faith in this better thing that will come, it can then be difficult to get there. And then in the sort of this kind of session, right, it's like you'll kind of sit in a circle, take it one by one. You'll say, firstly, these are the sort of the ways that I feel I've kind of not done, sort of not lived up to these principles in the past week, and also, or whatever. And then also, this is how, the other people around. It's very, like when it works well, sort of, I guess like very respectful. There's not sort of back and forth. So you'll say your piece, the other person will say their piece, and that's kind of it. There's no sort of argument, and you might feel, oh no, well, that's not fair because they thought, I didn't do the washing up, but actually I did do the washing up, but they weren't looking for, to take a simple example. Somehow it's always about washing up. And I did do the washing up. But, and it's sort of, and then as well as, I guess, having these shared ideals, there's also a focus on, where does the person come from? So you'd criticize like the background, the upbringing, the society the person's from, not the individual, right? So it's not, okay, well, let's stick with this example. It's not that you didn't the washing up, it's like you're a man and that's why you didn't do the washing up, or whatever it might be. And it can be deeper than that, obviously, but sort of trying to understand, okay, this is where you come from, and I think you're struggling to live out this principle. You're struggling to believe in what we're supposed to believe in, because, for example, for those of us who came from the West, often they'd be like, you're from this sort of liberal society, you struggle to believe that change is possible, you're kind of cynical, you need to get over that. Something that people said to me a lot, you don't have any attachments to sort of, where you're from, and so it's hard for you to imagine change anywhere, for example. Some of the stuff that really stuck with me that was said to me. And that's kind of how it works. And so, it's can be quite a jarring like practice and sort of experience, I think, for the people, particularly people who like come there from like Western movements, where we're, I guess, not used to this sort of such frank exchange. When it works well, I think it has a real kind of therapeutic function, but a sort of collective one, right? I suppose just it's quite simply that it clears the air, and I think once you sort of get over the sort of shock of I guess for me it would sort of initially it would be someone would say something, I'd be like, oh wow, they're like, they must hate me because they said this thing, but then like 5 minutes after it's finished and you're all laughing and you have a cup of tea because you've said it and you all agree we're going to try and get better in these ways that we've agreed on, right? So I think as a practice, it can be very helpful, and I think that then fits into having like a wider clear-eyedness about the failings also of their own political movement. And this is it's not. It sort of starts, I guess, with this subjective level, but then that feeds into that, this is a movement that was able to say, well, actually, we've been organising in this very traditional way. This isn't working. We're going to radically change it. And, sort of those ideas from, your kind of, tech meal, so your criticism session, is not supposed to just be about you, but maybe you would say, okay, I think we should change the way that we're working in general in this organisation or this wing of the movement, and that will all be fed up. And that kind of internal political culture is very alive and is very dynamic, and is very important. Of course, as you can imagine, like it doesn't always work. As I said, maybe this thing of where people have different ideas, like of what's ahead of them, can be challenging. And I think that's one of the challenges, right, with trying to implement it in in the West is this thing of probably we have very different ideas of what we want or believe is possible, and we can find it hard to talk about that. Also, I think it works certainly best when you have what for us, I suppose, would be the luxury of them is a necessity of living together, organising together 24/7, and you're in this extremely collective environment. You know, you wake up together, you exercise together, you cook together, you clean together, you sleep together. And the more kind of cohesive that collective is, I guess the easier it is to feel like it's something we're all doing together. Whereas, you know, sort of I've been in things like this where it becomes a bit like point scoring and, you know, like, of course, like, and there's like an internal politics to it, like, you know, like everything else. But I think, yeah, for me, like, yeah, it was like a very useful practice, which demonstrates some of the ways that, yeah, that they think about how the individual relates to the world. But then in Hannah's book, Burnout, which is very good, she sort of draws a comparison between some of, I guess the way that these processes would have worked, for example, in Maoist China, or in a more sort of traditional setting, you know, like the one I was speaking about, where these criticism sessions, you know, would have been, I guess, very harsh, and then also consciousness raising sessions among like feminists in the West in the 70s. So I suppose in terms of those practices and how the Kurdish movement does it, do you see similarities or lessons that can be learned?
Yeah, I mean, I got interested in trying to trace the genealogy of criticism, self-criticism, and I just sort of assumed that someone would have written a book about it, but as far as I can tell, they haven't, which is annoying, because then you have to try and figure it out yourself, which is annoying and hard. And it's a kind of slightly contradictory history, because actually, you know, it goes really back to quite kind of, even like, you know, like Stalin wrote like an essay about the necessity for self-criticism. And yeah, in the kind of new left, like in the West, there was this kind of, there were a quite kind of simplistic understanding of practices that were kind of undertaken in China after the revolution, that, you know, people were drawing on a very small number of sources available in English and kind of being inspired by them and then making up their own practices. And those went in really different directions, sometimes very, and I don't think that it feels like there's something inherent about it that's either really tends towards being really, really harsh and kind of cruel, or that tends towards this kind of more almost something verging on a sort of more sort of like liberal kind of, you know, fluffy, let's talk about our feelings thing. I feel like you can sort of find examples of movements and groups that have at least cited some influence or just used the word self-criticism, or kind of that. I think it seems like it's had many different sorts of trajectories. But I guess I was interested in how it broadly seems to have, you know, like I've never been in a group that did it, you know, and I heard the Palestinian youth movement here does self-criticism sessions, but it doesn't feel as embedded. And I guess I'm interested in, like movements like in Kurdistan, where it's like a kind of an embedded thing that obviously like there's some sense of a kind of familiarity with it and a sort of ritualized quality to it, or a kind of presumably, like, and sets of, I guess, guidelines for like, this is how to do this thing. But it seems to me like it's taken many, many different forms in different contexts.
I think, and there are other groups and movements that are trying to do things like this. I know in the UK, some of them directly learning from the way the Kurdish movement does it. Some not. I think, it sort of being embedded in a broader political culture is like a really important part of it. And I suppose, it's something that for me was, maybe I touched on this already, but this sort of sense of being part of something so much larger than yourself is, you know, it's okay, in case there's this sort of discipline and, you know, sort of, for example, someone will come and be like, oh, you know, this person will be senior, you know, normally in the sense that they're old, they've managed to survive for like 30 years, so there's probably something to learn from them without getting blown up by Turkey. And there is this kind of respect now, and, you know, sort of particularly like male respect for women, also this respect for, I guess like older comrades, experienced comrades, but there is also something leveling about it, right? And, you know, sort of very often these sort of very senior people, you know, would come, but they would often be the ones who'd be like, okay, look, that's like, you know, you're from Scotland or you're from England, like you've got a sort of outside perspective, what are we doing wrong? Tell me. And you're like, well, I don't know, like you've like got this whole revolution and like I can't organise a piss up in a brewery, but they were like, no, let's talk. Like, and I guess for them, it's like they have the confidence, you know, to hear that criticism and to like take it on board. And I think, and I think that's sort of commendable. And then there's this kind of equality while still recognising those differences that is like really important. And then that also, like I say, sort of here we've been speaking about the kind of internal culture of this movement, right? In terms of Rojava, right? There's sort of the situation is a little different because, you know, there are sort of people there who are part of this movement, paid up members, want to see this sort of liberated society happen. There's, I guess, at the other extreme, you know, a lot of people who are very determined to kill as many people as they can to stop this from happening, and, you know, like a lot of violence against this region. Then, you know, but in between that, you know, you have a lot of people, you know, there's millions of people living there, quite a lot of whom probably like, so yeah, kind of quite into the ideas of the movement to some degree, you know, sort of maybe women who are like, okay, this is giving me some freedoms that, you know, I never had before, maybe people who have worked with the movement for a long time, but, you know, they also have some reservations, you know, have some criticisms, or people who are, you know, don't really care about the political ideas, but they're like, okay, these people can protect us from war and from starvation, so we're with them. Or maybe some people are like, okay, you know, they're just going to pay me and my family so I can survive. There's a whole kind of range, and so because of that, then I guess this movement has been forced to, but sort of driven to like live out this commitment as well, like in terms of responding to the like pressures on the street, and, you know, the sort of like civil society there that disagrees, I guess, on a lot of these points, maybe particularly around the movement's vision for women in what is like most societies a very patriarchal society, but, you know, other aspects of all sorts of aspects, I suppose, of how they're trying to sort of reorganize life. And again, like, to their credit, like, you know, the movement, like, I think, you know, they're in a difficult situation of sort of trying to implement these ideas, but, you know, the idea is sort of in this community to determine its own future, but then sometimes that community will say, well, actually, we're not interested in any of those ideas, and we don't think that women should be taught these ideas, for example, and what do you do then? And they have, they do kind of try to find ways to listen, you know, to the sort of local civil society as well, do these kind of public consultations and have people come in, and there is a kind of genuine, I think, openness, which I found very commendable on behalf of them to listen to the local people. That doesn't mean that sort of the local will is always like respected, like particularly in terms of sort of military and geostrategic situation. Then a lot of things are not really in anyone's hands. And for sure, like, you know, if at these sort of public consultations, people will complain a lot, right? But I think that's good that they can complain, and that's like really important, and like particularly there, like in the Syrian context, it's But so they're sort of being driven, I suppose, to think about some of these ideas, you know, not just internally in the movement, but also in terms of its engagement with like the real world.
Yeah. I mean, obviously this is a book about Rojava, but it's also a book that's kind of using that kind of specific context and struggle in order to make some kind of broader arguments about hope and despair. And you talk about a lot of different theorists in the book, and, you know, not all of them really associated with the left, like Nietzsche, Agamben, Kierkegaard. But one of the kind of key thinkers for the book is Ernst Bloch, and specifically his kind of 3-volume work, The Principle of Hope. Obviously, the title of the book is Hope Without Hope. What do you understand hope without hope to mean, and how were you sort of, what was it about Bloch's work specifically that you were kind of inspired by?
I mean, I suppose, maybe one reason for saying hope without hope is there's been a lot of other books recently called like Hope Against Hope. But what's Terry Gilder's one is like Hope Against Optimism. There's another, basically like a lot of people, I guess, are thinking about this question of, how do we hope in hopeless times, hope in the dark? Rebecca Solnit, another one. So I think this kind of idea, was like all the other ones. Well, I need one that's like more like dramatic than all of these ones. So that was like the only thing I could say. But I think, like that's like
no hope.
Yeah, it's got a ring to it. But I guess sort of what I suppose the idea of like hope without hope, it's maybe a bit less about Bloch, a bit more. It comes from this idea of the like. Absurdism. So this idea of like the leap of faith, which is like an idea from Kierkegaard and like religious philosophy that faith, only begins when you can't reason your way to a commitment, right? Because then it's not faith. It's you're like, oh well, it's rational. It's only when you despair and you're like, there is no way that you can then. But and yet I believe. This like and yet, I think is like. To me, it's a very effective idea, and Kierkegaard is speaking like religiously. I'm also from like a religious background, and so I've sort of that idea like spoke to me. Like I sort of found that like an affinity, I suppose, with this idea of you can only believe when you give up on rationalization and you know, it's almost, you don't think, you just do, you just act, you just leap, you just go, right? And so I suppose that was sort of the idea of hope without hope, that there needs to be, or there often is, like a passage through like despair before you get back to hope, right? And choosing to do something anyway. And that doesn't mean, or, you know, everyone has to suffer, you know, and everyone we have to be miserable, or, you know, or we all have to go to Syria, or we all have to go through sort of political heartbreak or whatever it might be in order to get to our goal. But I think it was also, I guess a kind of a fact that like I saw in, you know, sort of people around me, that sort of people who were able to sort of, you know, I've long seen, I suppose, that, you know, people who had been through, sort of very tough, even personal times, you know, as well as political times, or some combination of the two, but are those who were sort of able to stick with organisation for decades on decades. And and then you'd see it, I suppose, as again, I was kind of saying, there was a way in which I suppose a lot of the sort of younger comrades in Kurdistan, for example, but again, I think this is not unique to there, were sort of a little bit more brittle, a little more sort of, you know, sort of, I guess, afraid of failure. But the older comrades who'd been through so much were kind of like, well, still here, still alive, so I guess it's revolution time. But, you know, we're sort of able to, you know, had suffered a lot and would sort of come out with these stories and be like, my God, like what a thing you've been through. But because of that, they were sort of able to say, well, you know, the only possible solution, right, is to keep organising and to keep fighting. And so, I mean, in terms of Ernst Bloch, he's just, he's an amazing writer who I would encourage, people to read. And I suppose sort of, his book, The Kind of Principle of Hope, expresses some of the similar ideas in terms of political hope, as sort of, Marxism. You know, he's like a sort of spiritual Marxist, right? Writing in the shadow of the Second World War, exiled from Germany. And he sort of, to him, Marxism is this kind of faith, right? The faith that all things will be transformed into their opposite. And he then, in his sort of, this quite idiosyncratic writing style that I probably can't quite like articulate, but he sort of sees this hope, this sort of pouring out of life, you know, present in everything, and sort of the fact that humans see hope in everything that we read it into everything we see around us, into nature, into our own culture, expresses the fact for him that, you know, we're all kind of yearning towards this great tomorrow, which can only be for him this like socialist revolution, which maybe sounds a bit like trippy, but I think, you know, one sort of thing is for me was, you know, that he, along with a lot of the other writers that I speak about in the book, was writing, you know, in the context of sort of genocide, in the context of World War II, and, you know, was able to like think about the Jewish experience. For example, he writes very movingly in the aftermath of World War II, criticizing like already like the new state of Israel, and he's saying sort of, you know, as a Jewish writer, right, and saying that you know, sort of the only true Zion, like the only true like redemption for them can be creating a sort of socialist world, and can't be this state. And that was a very kind of courageous position, you know, at that time to take, and very sort of clear-eyed and very foresighted. And I think the fact that he, for example, was, you know, in the midst of this, and, you know, and he wasn't a fool, you know, he knew very well what was happening, and he knew the dangers of fascism, and he knew what the Jewish people had gone through in the Holocaust. But to say, again, it's this kind of, and yet, because of that suffering, nothing less than this better tomorrow is necessary. And that was something that I think, was certainly really present in Kurdistan. And, you know, of course, you know, there were also people who've suffered genocide, also people who are going through these repeated bouts of ethnic cleansing. And so this sense that nothing less than like a great solution can just, And I think then, in terms of our own movements, what does that mean? Like, maybe, sort of in those the last two chapters of the book, you know, I speak about hope, sort of hope in genocide and hope in the sort of climate apocalypse, and I mean in different ways. But I think sort of the sort of the climate crisis is sort of, you know, for better and for worse, is sort of creating that sense. You know, I think more and more people feel that way, and we don't always know what to do with that sense, but that sort of existential dread, you know, is being translated into like very brave acts, and I think that's really important. And I think, you know, that will continue and sort of spread and deepen. And I think also, I speak also about sort of this international solidarity, and, you know, particularly like in a time of genocide. And I don't know, I want to pick my words quite carefully here, because, you know, I don't mean that, oh, well, you know, it's good that there's climate catastrophe, or it's good there's a genocide, because then you can do something really big, right? But I mean that there's a sort of sense of duty that like emerges from that, which I think is really important. I'm really glad to see, like, especially in younger people, like here in the UK, and I'm really impressed when I speak, you know, with like, the youth, about sort of, you know, how they feel about these two sort of things in particular, and sort of the lengths they're prepared to go to for it. And to them it's almost obvious, no, because, you know, you're living in a crisis, and of course, you know, to be here in the UK, even in a sort of, in the midst of global warming, is not the same as, you know, it is for people worldwide, and the suffering is not going to be the same for those young people as it will for young people in Kurdistan or in Palestine, elsewhere. But then I think that sort of sense of shared duty is something that, can, I think, be built on, and that we can understand, in our own movements now, and to respond, like, not with sort of doomerism or like defeatism, but with this kind of future vision. And that's, I suppose, something that I would take from Bloch and his context.
I've thought quite a lot about questions of hope and hopelessness, and I guess maybe also distinguishing between acting hopefully, while also, I think, maybe acknowledging that it's also important to, or it would be weird to live in the world as it is now and not be also open to feelings of despair. Like, that's also important, and shows that, like, I think, to kind of totally close oneself off to those things is obviously also, like, I guess a form of defeatism in a sense. So it's like how to kind of also act on the basis of those feelings, and that might not feel very hopeful, but it is acting hopefully, even if it's just...
There's something in your book that also was, that's like, I know you sort of speak about this feeling of sort of, feeling depressed and despairing, but also being like, actually my personal life is kind of fine, which I think was something, that, you know, when I came back from Syria, right, like, was difficult for me, and, you know, in different, you know, sort of going from, I guess, this experience of extreme crisis, but being like, okay, I'm here, and like, actually, you know, like, my life could be better, but like, it's all right, you know, and but sort of feeling, I guess, like, experiencing this, sense of, like, kind of sort of sense of despair or malaise, but then sort of, I don't know, I guess, like, I felt bad about it, or you sort of speak about feeling alienated from it, but then I guess, if you don't feel this sense of crisis, or it doesn't feel so immediate to you, how do you, you know, if you don't feel hopeless, how do you hope?
That's obviously a different question, isn't it? I guess you do talk quite a bit about the kind of Western, like, volunteers and solidarity across distance. You have a kind of a bit in there about, like, an analogy with the Spanish Civil War, and like this, and you have this kind of typology of the different maybe 4 different, you touched on it before, right, like the different you kind of break it down into these sort of, like, the comrade who's just arrived and is really, or like, but I feel like you do kind of make an argument also about that kind of obviously quite sort of fraught, or maybe also an argument against kind of hand-wringing too much about that kind of thing as well.
I suppose so. I was sort of, I mean, again, I sort of speak about it in the context of the international, like, volunteers who are there, but I think the sort of, I guess, there's kind of caricatures almost of, or composites of, you know, myself and different people there are sort of, representative of different kinds of people in any political organisation or just in life that we know, right? And I suppose to sort of, there's maybe there's like a pragmatism to it, no, that like part of, and maybe this connects also to the question of self-criticism, right? Is that sort of part of the book is, sort of what are the sort of actual tactics we use to get by day to day, and, you know, maybe sometimes we're like, you know, you go on the action or the protest or you organise the thing and you're like, actually, this is a bit of a waste of time, but you do it anyway. Why? Because maybe, I mean, for me, like, you don't want to let your comrades down, or you don't want to let your friends down, you don't want to be seen to let them down even, but I think that's a very good reason to do something. And even the sort of doing things, as a performance or as a kind of ritual, like, you know, like protest, I think is a really good example that you touch on, that you know, when you go on a big protest march, normally you're not like, well, they're going to be like, oh, really? Fine, we'll change that law. Thank you. It's about the experience of being there. It's about the sort of ritual and going through it and being like, okay, there are other people who feel the same as me and I'm going to discuss with them. And it's not really about Downing Street at all, you know, sort of a lot of the time. But having those kind of sort of ritualistic behaviours can be a way to sort of work through that kind of sense of malaise or despair, right? I speak also about, like the use of kind of humour and being like, like honestly, this is all a bit shit, isn't it? But we're going to do it anyway. I guess these like different methodologies. And I suppose probably that was, maybe that was also quite personal, knowing that I'm sort of, I'm quite a like cynical like person from whatever, like university educated background, like reads a lot of books. So I suppose some of that was sort of trying to be honest, like about how I and other people who are like me like respond to might sort of have a particular response to some of these situations, but being like, actually that's okay, but also it should be possible to sort of talk about that honestly, right? And that can then in time kind of lead to this kind of working through, right, that sort of leads to something like deeper and more profound. And I think there are times in everyone's life where you sort of feel like, oh, it's almost a lifestyle, right? I'm doing this stuff because that's just what we do, but I'm not really feeling it now. But you keep going, and I think that's good. And it can be good, and it's good to be kind of aware of that, but it can, help you in this working through process, right? And I think again, something that was sort of striking in that setting was the fact of living in this very communal way and having these responsibilities to people around you, for example, in your book you speak about the sort of opening vignette as this one that's opening vignette, but this description of waking up on a mattress the day after Corbyn had got his ass handed to him and like lying in bed being depressed, right? And I sort of speak about something quite similar in my book in terms of, sort of when there was the war, when Turkey was attacking, it was sort of, somehow it was like, it was a really hard time and people were dying, but there was so much energy and you weren't fighting with each other, right? Because you're focused on the enemy outside. But then there comes a day when, okay, like we've had the defeat, be it big, be it small, be it electoral, be it military, be it our spaces got shut down, whatever. And that's when the infighting comes out and the recriminations come out, right? Like between people. And I think that was then like there where I saw kind of the importance of like at that time, a lot of us I think were just pretty depressed. It was a bad time, but you got out of bed. Why? Because your comrades were there and you didn't want to let them down, and it was your turn to make the breakfast in the morning, so you did it because that's just what you do, right? And then that actually helps. And then also I think I saw there there was sort of a lot of different people who'd washed up there for all sorts of reasons. Some of them political, some of them like not political at all, like a couple with probably quite dodgy politics who just whatever ended up there. But I also saw for people who were not into any of this stuff before, being like, oh, okay, there's something there, and through kind of living it and through experiencing it and through that repetition, like deepening like their own commitment to the cause.
Okay, well, we've been speaking for an hour, so maybe we should take some questions. I was going to ask about left melancholy, but we don't have to do that. Does anyone have a question for Matt?
I'm kind of curious because there's, it's a sort of, I don't know if you'd call it a matriarchal society, but like more of it's not a patriarchy that you're describing. Has that been seen to have a positive effect on women's mental health and maybe like fewer mental health crises in women?
I might I'll maybe invite Jenny to say something about that. What I would say is so there's kind of two things at play, right? One is like the internal sort of political culture of the Kurdish movement. And then one is Rojava and this sort of civil society, right? Today we've spoken more about this internal political culture, which is itself a big thing. Itself encompasses hundreds of thousands of people to some extent. And that's sort of, so Rojava itself it's a patriarchal society. These ideas they're sort of trying to disseminate, and a lot of women do live according to these principles. But as I said, like the majority of women in Rojava are homemakers. They, sort of many of them may not work or may work for a bit, but then raise children. And there is, society is still, I guess, people are still like religious as well, which has an effect, sort of Kurds, also Sunni Muslims, and that plays out in like particular ways in terms of what patriarchy looks like there. And so, I think you couldn't say that it's not a patriarchy, but within the movement, these are the ideas they're trying to implement. So I think that's important to note. And then, in terms of the like impacts for women's mental health, I would maybe like let Jenny speak specifically. In general, I think it's sort of remarkable how this collective culture does help people. It doesn't help all of the people all the time. But I think this idea of having something bigger than yourself, and another aspect that we haven't spoken about, is they have this big kind of martyr culture, like a big kind of respect for the dead, I suppose, and then coming with that comes the sort of respect for suffering and for hardship, which lessens the toll that things might have on people. So in Hannah's book, she speaks about how sort of when they were developing the idea of PTSD, it was sort of funny because it was in like the context of Vietnam, and actually there was a lot more PTSD among the American soldiers than among the militants on the Vietnamese side, because they knew they were fighting for a just cause. So they didn't develop what came to be known as PTSD because they were able to work through that to some extent. And I think that is true. At the same time, there is still kind of great suffering and great hardship. And I think the flip side of this kind of culture is certainly that some of these things don't get talked about, and there is an expectation that everyone will be fine, and everyone isn't always fine. And maybe one final thing I would say is you really see the impact. And when people leave and they come back from having been a volunteer, they're back to the West. It's often very hard for us because we leave that sort of intense situation where you feel kind of watched and observed, and you feel part of something bigger, and you come back and you go back to your old job and whatever, and then so you get back into this more isolated mode of existence. That's very hard. So I think that tells a tale. But maybe you want to say something more, Jenny.
I agree with everything that's been said. I'm Jenny, and if it's not obvious, I've also spent some time in Java. Actually, that's where we met. We were there at the same time. I've worked very closely with the women's movement and spent a lot of time in the women's movement. I think I'd really agree with what Matt's saying there, in the sense that it's not so much that it's not a patriarchy. It's a patriarchy is as alive and kicking in Rojava in the Middle East as it is everywhere in the world. But the difference is that there's this very strong, very clear, very organised kind of push to build an alternative as well as against it. And I think you see the impact that has on well-being, extremely, particularly when you consider the circumstances that it's still taking place in, and that it's still a war zone, been under sanctions for a long time. It's a really, really poor place, and despite all of that, you can see the impact, and sometimes you kind of stop to wonder, wow, what would they have managed if it wasn't for all this? It would be even more. And there kind of isn't the separation there. There isn't there isn't a useful sort of direct translation from mental health into Kurdish, for example, and I wouldn't use it. People do understand when someone is heartbroken, very sad, hopeless, you might say the situation of their heart or brain is not good, but it's not as disconnected from general well-being and kind of material stuff, which I think has potentially a shadow side, as Matt mentioned. It can hide underlying things, or people don't always have the language to explain it, but I also think it's got a real strength to it, in that someone's general well-being and safety and security, physical safety and security in day-to-day life, and material recourse and political empowerment just would be so different if that movement wasn't there, and the impact that has on someone's entire sense of self, and I might say empowerment, and the literal translation would be force or strength or power, and it's very much not done. And for me, there's something in that, a lot of the stuff that you have talked about there is these kind of sort of two seemingly contradicting things that are happening together, the top down and the horizontal, or is there any point, or is there all the point in the world? And it's like at the same time we've achieved so much and there's success and victory here, and at the exact same time everything is still to fight for, and we haven't done anything yet, and we haven't got anywhere where we need to be, so we're still doing it. And that doing is what I think gives that strength and gives that empowerment.
And purpose.
Purpose. Exactly. So that's useful to know. Anyone else wants to add anything?
Maybe not a very deep question, but when were you there? What was your...
I was there like 2018 till 2020, and I visited at the start of this year for a shorter time. So yeah, it had actually been a while, so I was glad to go back. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think it was also maybe a sort of interesting time to be there because there was this big sort of, maybe when people remember it was, people remember, right, sort of Kurdish women fighting ISIS, and it was this big story, right, like sort of 2015, 2016, and so to some extent, yeah, by the time I was there, that like sort of moment, and I guess this moment of sort of revolutionary, extraordinary like explosion had kind of subsided, and it was actually this time, it was a hard time, and like Turkish attacks were coming against the region, and so I had sort of thought, okay, I'm going to go out there and there'd just been this big Turkish invasion, like, and then I arrived there and I was like, well, they're gonna maybe it's all over, and maybe they'll have like given up because like they're getting attacked by this like enormous like Western-backed army. And that was one of the very first things that struck me was they were like completely like, no, we're like busy and we're like building this new thing, and why would we stop just because we're getting attacked, like whatever. And yeah, and then I suppose for me it was also interesting, to follow sort of the period where some of these challenges came in terms of it was no longer this great sort of moment. It was the morning after, right? And okay, now we have these we've got these millions of people, and they'd sort of expanded out of the Kurdish regions into these Arab regions where people had like never heard of them before, and where they sort of had to start from zero in a Kurdish society is also patriarchal and all the rest of it, but in a sort of very challenging, and like these Raqqa, like the former ISIS capital, right, and sort of begin there, going door to door, speaking to people and saying, hey, this is how I wanted to do things. So it was really interesting to be able to follow that process, yeah.
There's some interesting details in the book about, this kind of not taking a really harsh punishment to people who were like formerly ISIS, right? Like there's a kind of like a rejection of like certain kinds of treatment of those. Yeah, could you say that?
Yeah. Something we haven't touched on, but it's probably worth addressing like a little bit more depth is like the Kurdish armed forces in Syria, as I said, have this relationship with the United States, and that kind of developed, sort of as a really is kind of, as on the one hand as a matter of happenstance, on the other hand also obviously because the United States has its own interests for being in the region, having its military bases there, and the Kurds were fighting this war against ISIS, like initially by themselves, and and for them was and is this anti-fascist war against anti-woman like organization that was trying to occupy and kill kill the women of those regions especially, and the US then intervened with airstrikes against ISIS and forged this military partnership with the Kurdish armed forces, and that's always been on the one hand it's always been sort of very like the US call it temporary, transactional, and transient, temporary, something like that. TTT, temporary, tactical, and transient. And it's sort of very much focused on this like anti-terror mission, like blah blah, rather than they're sort of then very much not engaged with all of this stuff that we've been speaking about today. And it was much more about, so actually the Russians and the Americans are both present in Rojava sort of since 2018, like, and half of it had a Russian presence, half had an American presence in terms of the bases there, and they were both there to sort of push against the other one, and that sort of clash like created room for these guys. They kind of had relations with both sides, the Russians and the Americans, and could sort of use that to like keep trying to advance these ideas. Great, but obviously that comes with costs, challenges, and one of the major ones was sort of what happened after this ISIS war. So the war was won, they defeated them, but they then were left with somewhere on the order of like around 10,000 like local ISIS fighters, 2,000 foreign ISIS fighters, around 30,000 women and children from the ISIS side. So then this region, sort of in line with these principles, like espouses a kind of non-carceral ideology. And before all of this, it used to have, had almost no one in prison. Now they've got, these like 10,000 ISIS members, and you can't just let them out because they'll just keep trying to kill you. So they're, kept in detention. And you could sort of see, and then, it's like, which has like been very hard because it costs a lot of money. The like humanitarian situation in the whole region is bad. Like, in the camps it is also bad. And you can also see, I think, like they're like, obviously you can see the kind of American influence in the, sort of running it like in like a military way. And there's been a big kind of, so the administration to as best it can, does try to like espouse these principles, obviously feed people, treat them with dignity, treat them with respect, provide sort of basic education. And they also have programs that are aimed at, sort of like rehabilitation and working especially with the women and with the children and, trying to like get them back. And also they do like amnesty programs for the local ISIS members and sort of, let them like sort of low ranking people sort of go back to their communities, but sort of sign a deal that they won't be in ISIS anymore, which seems to be working. But then you have the problem of these thousands and thousands of foreigners, and Britain, is one example of a country that's like, well, with like Shamima Begum, right, who some of you might have heard of, and they're like, fuck it, leave her over there, like lock her up, throw away the key. Whereas what the Kurdish administration wants is for Britain to take responsibility, take back their nationals, or if they're not going to do that, provide more kind of funding for their upkeep, or allow them to put them on trial. Because this is one of the other issue is the Americans won't let the Kurdish administration have trials for the foreigners because they're like, you're not a real country, you don't have the right. And have repeatedly kind of blocked this. And the same as the Americans have also blocked them from holding elections in Rojava because they were like, you can't do that because that would legitimate your administration, but you're not an administration, you're just an armed force. So then, they've like haven't been put on trial. Even if they could put them on trial, it's then you put them on trial, and then what happens? Where do they go? What happens when they're released? Who takes responsibility? So it's like a clusterfuck, I think would be the like appropriate word. And I mean, it sort of shows like the sort of cynicism, like obviously of the American policy towards the region and the short sight in this, in terms of like repeating these problems. But there's another major challenge facing the region, which they are trying to deal with, but it's not easy.
If not, maybe you can just do a more like informal chatting, buy books, sign books.
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for coming, and stick around and have a chat with me or with Hannah about her work, or I'm sure Jenny will talk at you, or or with you. About all of this stuff. But thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Burning House for letting us do this event. I'm really glad you could be here, and obviously support the bookshop. Buy their stuff, and I guess, for example,
and I brought some of these. There's like 3 of them. Sorry, but if you want to add them as a special prize to some of the lucky books, I don't know. They're like a more kind of what's actually going on the ground in Rojava at the moment, if people want that sort of more technical update.
Jenny's book is called Worth Fighting For. It's do you want to give a little blurb? You don't have it with you, but you can give a little.
No, I don't have that one with me. It's called Worth Fighting For, and it's free to get from Active Distribution or some other bookshops somewhere probably. And it's not just my book. I wrote half a book. My amazing book wife Natalia wrote the other half. And it's kind of trying to take lessons from all the experiences that we had in Rojava for organising back here and for our reality back here, and done in a sort of quite storytelling, also our experiences that were over there kind of way. But it doesn't have a up-to-date what's going on because it's a couple of years old now, so the pamphlets might be more useful for that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you so much.